Hello, and welcome to Pagan Perspectives. This is the first episode of a new podcast that I'm creating where I take major issues and subjects that fill our lives and give a pagan perspective on how to deal with them, combining theology, metaphysics, philosophy, and religion to help people live their lives in a more esoterically aligned way. Now, in this first episode, I want to talk about perhaps the biggest topic that I'm going to be asked about when I start making this show. When I announced it, I asked people questions on what they wanted me to talk about. And pretty much like half the responses related to this subject, because I think in terms of subjects people struggle with, this is pretty close to the top of the list. And that would be love. Love. What a good emotion. What a good experience when you're in it. But also, what a painful experience when it doesn't go exactly how we expect it. Love is confusing, love is complicated, and our modern way of life does not make that any easier. If you go on the internet and you scroll for even a couple minutes, you will see endless videos, podcasts, discussions, and truthfully, what they are debates about what love should be. How should people love? What is love? What should dating culture be? How can we fix it? Should people give up on love? Should people embrace love more? Should it be addressed through some new system, or should people revert to the past? This is a massive debate. And I think in all of it, people have lost sight of what love is. I think the greatest irony of all time is that dating discourse online is detached from what it's all about. And that is love. That is emotion. And emotion is not necessarily the most rational thing out there. So I'm going to explore this topic from the theological pagan perspective, because there's a lot of theology and metaphysical concepts that actually relate to love. Because love is not really, a singular thing. It's not a simple thing. And when we fall in love, a lot of things happen to us. So without further ado, let's discuss love. So the first thing I want to sort of ask, and that needs to be the first thing that's asked, is sort of the core question of this entire episode. What is love? Because I think before we can discuss how to fall in love, how to have a healthy relationship to love, how to fix modern dating culture and all of that, we need to define what love even is. And I think a lot of people have forgotten what love is. They see love as kind of just a status. A big thing I see when I read discussions about relationships is that it almost seems like people are chasing the status of having a relationship and not the reality of merging with another human being. So first, let's go over love. So in ancient theology and metaphysics, coming from the Hellenic pagan world, I think has the best definition of love. And that definition begins with understanding that there's actually not one type of love, which I think we all consciously understand, right? Like the way you love your boyfriend and the way you love your dog and the way you love your roommate and the way you love your mom, I think we all understand are different types of love. Of course, they're all loves. They are, but they're not the same. And I think often when people try to say like they're not the same love, they fall into this trap of being like, well, not all love is the same. So there's like a hierarchy of love, right? There's like a best love and then a lower love. And I think a lot of people kind of put romantic or sexual love at the sort of top of this hierarchy. They're like, okay, well, the elite love is romantic and sexual love, and they ignore these other loves that exist. And I like that because in the ancient world, I don't like that people do that. I like the way the ancients explain it because the ancient Greek pagan concept of love is not hierarchical. It's not ranked. It just understands these type of loves are different. They are not the same. And that doesn't mean one is worse or better than the other, because I think it's weird to rank that. I think that's not really healthy. And it actually, I think it speaks to an atomization of society where people, instead of being part of larger communities, they're part of these small interactions, right? These little tiny parts of their life, right? Like I think, and I look around, like when I lived in New York City, as you guys know, I spent many years living in New York. Despite being in a city of millions and millions of people, a lot of people were only friends with like a couple people. And then they had like their outer circle of people they would see at the parties they regularly went to, but they weren't like close with those people, right? They were close with, their best friend, their boyfriend, something like that. Those were the people they were close to, but they didn't have these other community interactions, the other communal relationships. And I think that's a real failing of the way that we live. I think people need to have more communities, more people around them, and more love in their life. Instead of being like, well, my romantic love is the number one love, so I should discount all other loves. Like, I think we should be just trying to maximize the amount of love around us. So without further ado, I do want to go through the Greek words for love. So if you are a Thelemite, for those who don't know, I have a long background in Thelema. This specific first type of love we're going to talk about is very heavily stressed within Thelema. In fact, Thelema, the name of the paradigm, which is this occult paradigm started by Aleister Crowley, and then developed by a lot of other people later on, uses this numeric acronym called 93 because the gematria of the word thelema, or will, it's literally a translation of the word will, from Greek, equals 93. And there's another word that's a key part of thelema that also equals 93. That would be agape. So agape, it technically means affection, but that's not what it literally means. Like, there's always a literal definition of something and then a more complicated explanation. And agape is, it's a really ancient concept, but you actually, if you have a Christian background, you'll probably be kind of familiar with it. Agape is basically the love we have for the gods and the love the gods have for us. Now, some people do define it as like your affection you have for people around you and your affection for the world. That's not correct because, I technically that's using the word correctly, but metaphysically, is that correct? No. The Thelemic explanation is that we are all surrounded by agape. Agape is basically a metaphysical current that goes throughout the world and fills the world. The world is full of love. And if you have that Christian background, you'll understand that on a mystic perspective, Jesus corresponds to Tiferet, or the spear of loving kindness in the Kabbalistic sense of mysticism that started with Judaism, then went into Christianity, and then into Hermeticism, and then into every metaphysical system coming out of the West. Tiferet is endless love. And so that relationship Jesus has with humanity is an agape style relationship. Within paganism, the relationship we have with the gods is often a kind of agape type relationship. Now, a lot of people are going to come in and criticize me for that because, the gods are not wholly loving all the time. So how can there be agape if the gods have severity to them, if the gods have a harsher component? And I say, how can there be agape without that harsher component, right? There needs to be balance in the universe for anything to function. And so love and severity have to go together. And in fact, they actually form each other because when we look at the chain of being and the emanationist theology that the West subscribes to, starting with the early Platonist, there is this idea that, the divine contains both mercy and severity. There is both light and dark. Now, I will not say good and evil because I do not believe severity and evil are equivalent concepts. I think evil kind of does exist metaphysically. It's a bit of a different idea than what I'm talking about. By severity, I mean restriction and constraints. There's also a way of interpreting this where, and a lot of people don't like it phrased this way, where like the masculine is mercy and the feminine is severity, or the masculine is sort of endless force, creation, outpouring, and then the feminine is what gives it shape. If you think about the sexual act, as a lot of Thelemites describe it, you see the man releases and the woman actually forms it into a human being, right? Force and form is what I'm talking about when I say mercy and severity. I'm not actually talking about like metaphysical evil or like demons or any of that. I think a lot of people get that confused. So yeah, I mean, for love and agape to exist, there must be severity within divinity. And that's why there are harsher gods like Shiva, gods like Saturn, gods like Ares. Those type of gods exist because they provide a very important function metaphysically. So yeah, I mean, agape and the fact that the gods are not all love and light are not contradictory things because love itself is not all. And people use this word love and light to refer to like a very specific thing, but it's not that. And I don't think agape existing contradicts that truth. In fact, a thing you'll learn when you get into metaphysics is that often there are sort of seeming contradictions, right? There are these things that seem like they're in opposition to each other and they're both true, and that sort of confuses the brain. But the thing is, these seeming contradictions are part of metaphysics, and they're why things are complicated and why things can't be explained in 3 seconds. Because there are some metaphysical concepts where, like, you'll read a whole book on it and you'll be like, well, you could have said that in 5 minutes. But the reason why it's not said in 5 minutes is without that longer explanation, that 5-minute understanding that you take afterwards couldn't really be understood without it being fleshed out. And that's why I wanted to flesh that out a bit. Agape is a big part of love, though. Agape is, if anything, we say in our normal culture that romantic love is the highest love. And I don't like hierarchical loves, but if I'm going to put a love at the top of that, I would have to put agape, because agape is really a healing thing, and it is the opposite of despair. So the worst state a human being can possibly be in is despair. which is a spiritual disease of the heart that basically means that you think you are worse than everything else in the universe. Despair can also be seen as a kind of inverted narcissism, where the narcissist sees themselves as like the perfect human, right? They are grandiose. They think they're the best person who's ever lived. They think they're a god themselves. And then the despairful person, they think they're worse than anything that has ever existed. And the truth is, we're not worse than everything that has ever existed. That's just impossible. We are all just normal people who have good and bad things. And holding on to agape holds so much hope within it that it is a sort of antidote to despair. When we think about the myth of Pandora's box, I'm sure we all have heard that one, right? This woman Pandora opened a box in Greek myth, and out of it became, when she opened it, came all those horrible diseases, those horrible things, those awful things that plague humanity when we enter states of melancholia. But what also came out of it was hope. And agape is that key to hope, because the reason why hope came out is hope can actually overpower all of those other problems that came out of Pandora's box. So agape is actually one of the most important things we can possibly experience to heal ourselves and feel whole. Now, the next type of love is the love that I think everyone's sort of aware of the most, and it is the one that I'm going to be talking about largely on this podcast, and that would be Eros. So Eros comes from a myth called Eros and Psyche. And if you've ever heard the term psyche or soul or self, or, the term psychology even comes from the word psyche, it is this beautiful myth where, and it's a long story. I mean, there's a lot going on. Where basically so Eros is the god of romantic love, right? The god of erotic love. He is the son of Venus or Aphrodite, depending on if you like your Roman or your Greek names. Have a good conversation about that in the comments section. Where basically Psyche was this human girl. Psyche was absolutely beautiful. And, Aphrodite was kind of mad about this because people were paying more attention to Psyche than her, because Psyche was like, I guess, the original beautiful influencer TikTok girl, right? Whether you're thinking of, modern people who are really beautiful, like Psyche is them, right? And basically, Venus or Aphrodite wanted Eros to go after Psyche, and he goes down to do this, and he makes eye contact with her, and he felt his arrows, which were the arrows of love, pierce his heart and pierce her heart. And they begin to feel this wound where they yearn for each other, they want each other, and eventually they fall in love so hard that Psyche actually transcends her mortality and becomes the goddess of the soul. So the goddess of the soul is a sort of human that becomes a god. Now, the full myth is a bit longer than that. I'm, of course, simplifying it. I really recommend reading the myth of Eros and Psyche, even if you only read a longer summary, because it really does personify a lot about love. And I think it's I'm going to explore this a bit later, but that bit of yearning and wanting is a big part of romantic love. But yeah, so that is Eros. Eros is, attraction. It is love. Think about it. He was passionate for her. Eros is that intensity. A lot of people have this misconception that Eros is something you experience early on in a relationship and it fades away. Not necessarily true. Big misconception. But yes, Eros is the love you feel for your partner. Now, Philia is like the love you feel for your family and your community, friendship. It's those loves you feel for people in your life that you're not in a romantic relationship with. So, like the way you love your best friend, or you might love your mom or your brother, right? Philia, we all feel. I think philia of all types of love is actually the one we experience the most. And I think for a lot of people, it's really the first love that anyone feels, right? The first love you feel, when you're like a little baby, right, is for your parents, right? That is philia. If you note, like the way you feel philia for your friends versus your parents, it's actually just different degrees of philia, but it's still the same fundamental type of love. So the next one is storge. That is the way that like parents love their kids. Pretty much it's that type of love. There are some people who use storge to define the way you love things you've created. Like, say, if you're like the way I love my podcast and the stuff I talk about, like you could argue that's a type of storge. Some people who are really, attached to certain things, like if you have a hobby you're very attached to, or a place, like if you love a certain city you've been to. I mean, you could argue that's a type of storge. Storge is kind of just a love for things you've created. It gets used for other things. Like I find of all the types of love, storge is kind of used as like a miscellaneous love in certain writings. Like if they can't really put it in another category, they just kind of throw storge on it. But I think when we're talking about experience we have with storge, it's really like the love for things you've created, like your kids or something. I would say love people have for their pets is also a kind of storge. Um, so the next one is, and this is the hardest one to pronounce, so I apologize, I'm going to get this wrong. This is philatula. It's the love for yourself. So self-love is really, really important. I think we all understand that. And I think a lot of people don't understand self-love because I think a lot of people think self-love is like egotism. And no, 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 no. Self love is a care for yourself, a desire for you to be healthy, a desire for you to heal. I think curating this type of love is important on any spiritual journey because if you don't desire yourself to improve, you're not desiring anything. I mean, stagnancy is death. And so, curating this type of love for yourself is very important. And I think when it does become like a narcissism, it's no longer that type of love. Narcissism is, I mean, essentially a really harmful thing. And some people use this term to describe some of those bad traits. But I don't think that is because there's a clear difference between self love and wanting yourself to be safe, wanting yourself to accomplish things, wanting yourself to achieve, and wanting to be a bad person or vain or any of that. I think those are very different things. And I think when people lump those together, they're getting things wrong. Now, there's another thing. It's not really a type of love, but people often bring it up when they talk about the type of love. They call it like a sixth type of love. It's called xenia. It's basically like, being a hospitable person and caring for your community. I think xenia is not a type of love. I think it's more a desire to help your community and care for your community. But if you curate all these other types of love, xenia does flow from that naturally. Like you can't have all those type of loves in your life and not like desire to care for your community and, take care of people. So yeah, xenia does kind of go with these concepts, but it is a little bit different. Now, I do want to talk a bit about Eros because Eros is the one that defines dating, and I think Eros is lost. I think people don't understand Eros. I think Eros is a scary concept, and a lot of people actually would say Eros is toxic. So, what happens when you experience Eros? So, Eros, when we look at that myth of Eros and Psyche, what causes Eros? Eros is spontaneous. Eros, if you've ever seen that little drawing of Cupid with the bow, Cupid and Eros are the same spirit. What happens? They shoot the people. I'm sure you've seen this even in kids' cartoons, right? Cupid like hides up in the sky and fires arrows at people, and then they immediately fall in love. And I do think it's worth noting that arrow as a word and eros sound incredibly similar. I'm not a linguist, but I think there must be some sort of connection there. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's quite notable. But yes, what happens when you're shot with an arrow? Like literally, like let's say someone shoots you. As I said before, it pierces the skin. Arrows are used as a weapon. They're used in hunting. Arrows are violent little things. They get shot down and they kill. But in this case, of course, they're not killing you. They're causing a wound. Arrows is a wound. It's a wound that needs to be healed. And what happens is it makes a hole in your heart. So Plato has a really interesting concept that I think relates to Eros, and it is the idea of soulmates. So I'm sure we've all heard about soulmates, right? We know this term. We know soulmate is like your ultimate love. But isn't soulmate more than that? So the first idea of soulmates was a Platonic idea where essentially we used to actually have double our amount of limbs. And the male and the female were actually one conjoined creature, like a conjoined twin. It's a little bit of a freaky mental image, but stick with me on this. So originally, we were one unit, one person, and then we were fractured. And what happens is when you are fractured, when you are cut in half, you're once again wounded. And so what happens was we were separated from our other half. This is also where the term other half comes from. And throughout our lives, We are searching for our other half to conjoin with them again. We are looking for the soulmate we were separated from. And so, if you believe in a reincarnation based theology, which many polytheistic religions do, what essentially happens is every single cycle through samsara, you're on a quest to find your other half, the person who was conjoined with you, your soulmate. And then, through love, unite. Once again, before you are reunited with your soulmate, what are you? You are wounded. You are missing something. There is a state of lack. When you are without the person you have Eros for, you are in a state of lack, a state of deficit, a state of missing something. And so when you have that hole in your heart, when you're shot with the arrow, you are missing, you are lacking, there is something gone. And what happens is this actually causes quite a bit of discomfort. And it's a discomfort we're constantly feeling until we, reunite. So we don't think about it much. Like it's not occupying our brains. It's just kind of something we know isn't there. And then when we actually meet or make eye contact, this is also where the idea of love at first sight comes from, is like when you see someone, you recognize them, like you've known them through many lives, and then you feel that connection. Now, to reunite with your soulmate does not necessarily mean you felt that, but when that does happen, that is what that is. Yeah, you're in pain. You're yearning, you're desiring. Desire is a funny concept because there's a big philosophical debate on if desire is good or if desire is bad. I mean, certain systems like Stoicism essentially say that the route to healing, the route to enlightenment, is to cast off desire and stop desiring things entirely. I fervently disagree. I think desire is actually very important. I think desire is hunger. I think desire is motivation. I believe in the power of the will. I believe a big part of the spiritual journey is discovering your true will and following your true will. And if you do not desire that, how can that be done? I think when we are not in that state, we are desiring. I think the thing is, people struggle with the difference between want and will, and I think this is where a lot of the desire is bad comes from. So when you have your will, you have your true will, that's actually a higher purpose. It's a better purpose. It's not like a momentary want. And I think a lot of people can confuse desire with those lower wants, right? Like you want a cigarette, you want a cookie, you want to make out with the guy at the bar because you're in a bad mood, right? Those are all wants. And in a sense, that is a desire, but I don't like the word desire being used for that. I think we should call those things like cravings or urges or instincts, right? They're not really higher desires. And maybe if you can't separate that from desire, perhaps we could make a lower desire and a higher desire, right? Your higher desire is to reunite with your soulmate, to achieve gnosis, to get agape with the gods, right? And your lower desires are picking up the cigarette or, eating the extra popcorn or whatever your lower desires are, right? We all have different lower desires. I think we can all think of what ours are, right? And so making that distinction, I think, is very important because I think if you avoid desire, you essentially avoid life. And this is why I dislike a lot of philosophies that prize logic over feeling. Because I think when you do that, you're ironically being incredibly illogical because humans are emotional creatures. We are irrational creatures. And when you try to rationalize our irrational behavior, you end up lost. And so desire connects us to that heart instead of our head, which when it comes to love, you certainly need to be listening to that, right? So when you reunite, you experience a state that actually is divine. That early love, right? When you fall in love at the beginning, you know how people call that infatuation or obsession, and of course that can get bad. Like I'm not saying like become a stalker or something. Please don't do that. But when you get really attached, and this is reciprocal attachment, I don't mean like there's a term in psychology called limerence. Where you like get really attached to someone who doesn't notice you and you feel some of these symptoms, but no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about reciprocal infatuation, right? Reciprocal eros, that is eros, that early love feeling when you're, all clingy and cute, right? That's good. Limerence, bad. Obsession, bad. Maybe I shouldn't have used the word obsession. You guys get what I'm talking about, though, I think. The healthy version of that. They actually call it theomania. This term was used a lot in the ancient world. Theomania means divine madness. And when we're talking about people who have really intense spiritual experiences, we are also talking about theomania. Theomania, if you're a mystic and you've ever done like, say a mystical thing, like if you've ever done like whirling or you've done trance work or any of that, you've probably experienced something similar to ritualistasis, which is that really intense, energized state where you feel like the divine is flowing through you. It's very, very intense. Theomania is a form of that. You're just feeling arrows flow through you. And theomania is a divine thing. Mystics used to spend their entire lives chasing theomania. And so when you experience theomania, you need to lean into that. And theomania sort of puts us towards these relationships evolving and developing and becoming these archetypes like the lovers, right? All of that archetype, the lover archetype, comes from theomania. And some people will say that this cannot hold. You cannot stay in a state of theomania long term. And certainly things do stabilize out, they chill out, they cool down a bit. But I actually don't think Eros has to go away. A lot of people argue that Eros, as a relationship evolves, inherently moves into something like philia. I don't agree. I think that arrows can stay arrows. I think that flame can continue to burn. And I think a big part of relationships is keeping that flame burning and keeping it going. And that's why, when we talk about communication, we talk about continuing to flirt, continuing to date. That is keeping arrows alive. And that's why all that is so, so important. And, I was describing love as a spontaneous thing, right? An intrusive thing, a possessive thing. So, how does that square with the way that we're dating now? Well, it doesn't. It doesn't make sense. When you're dating in the way that people date now, how can that happen? And what I mean by that is not like you met someone in public and you felt all that. No, I mean like things like online dating. And of course, it can happen. If you go on a date with someone you met off the internet and then this happens, like that can totally work. But the weird calculated way people date, I think it makes it harder. I think a lot of people, when they're dating, they're not dating for people, they're dating for traits. They're trying to like maximize the best person they can ever get. And they're looking not for a human they love, but for like some concept of a partner. They're dating once again for status. And Eros doesn't really care. Eros does what Eros wants. And I think a big problem is people are dating people who meet all their criteria, who they don't actually feel arrows for. And if you don't actually feel arrows for someone and you're dating them and the relationship becomes long term, I mean, what's going to happen? I mean, is it even going to be able to convert into philia? I mean, maybe it can convert into philia, but if you're just dating someone because they match your things, how is that not philia the whole time? I think when people talk about resenting people later on, getting burnt out, getting bored, all of that. I think a lot of that does come from not actually chasing your soulmate, not actually chasing arrows, but chasing like a partner who just meets your boxes. As well with people who settle down, I think a large percentage of relationships are people just settling for people. Like they're like, okay, well, time to settle. Enough. I'm done dating. I'm just gonna pick someone. That's gonna lack arrows. And you're an adult. If you want to make that choice, you just want to like pick someone and have a relationship with them and not really love them. I mean, that's your life. I would say metaphysically, that's going to be harder on you, especially as I get into what happens with love as things evolve. But I mean, it's a legitimate choice. I just think both people should be aware of it. I think a lot of people are in relationships with people they don't really love, just out of convenience or out of feeling like it's time. And I know a lot of people who end up like I live in Appalachia now. There's a lot of divorced people in Appalachia, and when I talk to people who are divorced, I mean that's a pretty common theme, right? They just kind of felt like they needed to settle. And I mean, yeah, I don't think everyone gets experiences arrows. I think some people avoid arrows. I think some people are scared of arrows. They fear arrows is like codependency, or they're scared of it, right? And I think people do things to avoid it and find relationships with other intentions. And I think those are metaphysically less powerful relationships. But once again, I mean, you can do anything you want with your life. It's your life. If that's what you want to do, go for it. I don't feel like I can, tell people not to do things, but I can say it is not really going to become arrows. And a lot of the metaphysical things that happen when you're in love are simply not going to happen. Also with online dating, I think there's some people would say after hearing all this, that means you should avoid online dating. I don't think so. I think you just need to online date in a way that's not ordering Chinese food. I think a lot of people on like Hinge, like really treat it like they're on DoorDash getting like takeout, and are not considering that these are all human beings with emotions and feelings. And they're avoiding arrows because they want someone to match boxes, and I don't think that's healthy. Another thing is in modern dating culture, there's a lot of strategy involved, and logic. The head versus the heart. What a common philosophical debate, a moral debate that comes up in pretty much all conversations. I am a heart over head person. I fundamentally am. It is how I think, and it is what I think the world is closer to. I think when you're dating from a point of logic, like you're a Super Bowl strategist, Yeah, I mean, you're not going to be experiencing Eros. You're once again dating for some other intention, right? It's different. I think in general, we need to think of people as human beings and not as numbers. I think with a lot of modern dating culture, we've dehumanized people. We've thought of people as just like a person to swipe through. I mean, and not considered they're all human beings. And when people go on dates, like you need to realize like you're face to face with another human with as many emotions and flaws as you, and not see that person as some sort of number on a flow chart. Because I've seen people make these flow charts about their dating experiences, and I just when I see it, I'm like, okay, that's so detached from humanity and from our emotions and from how we work. And so I think this highly strategic way of dating fails a lot of people. Now, I will say it can be valuable because I do want to give nuance. I think that really strategic way of dating could be valuable if you are someone who has a tendency to end up in really toxic relationships. I think if that's your background, then perhaps it could be good until you heal your intuition. Because in modern life, a lot of people actually are what I would call instinct injured, where they don't trust their instincts, they don't trust their gut, they don't even understand their gut. Like they're completely cut off from their gut. They don't have any closeness with their intuition. Their intuition, like, is completely gone. And if you are super instinct injured, you need to heal your intuition. But since you don't even understand how to heal your gut, you can't listen to it until you understand that. Now, there's a legitimate case to say that you should not date while you are in that process, while you are doing shadow work, while you are healing. But I know, people don't always do that. I know how humans work. So if you are in a situation like that, perhaps the really strategic approach could actually benefit you. But once again, you still need to accept arrows. Yeah. And to be clear, I want to condemn one concept that comes up a lot in spiritual discussions of love because I think it's horrible, and it is the concept of twin flames. I have spoken out against twin flames. My first ever podcast, I did a whole episode about it. Twin flames is a really gross concept. I don't like it. Twin flames is a more new age concept that is kind of similar to soulmate, to the platonic idea. It's got that same idea that our souls are split into two bodies. But the problem with it is not, the idea that the souls are split in two bodies and we yearn for our other half. That is the basis of love. But the problem with twin flames is your twin flame, the way it's described is often that there is a push and pull, and that twin flames are like always having conflict. Like if you look at like the stages of a twin flame relationship, they talk a lot about extreme conflict. I don't believe your soulmate you're going to have extreme conflict with. I think twin flames, if it was just like a different way of explaining the platonic soulmate idea, I would have no problem with it. But the way twin flames are discussed, I think enables abusive relationships, enables high conflict relationships. If you have a high conflict relationship, I don't think you should be in that situation. And I think twin flame discourse kind of promotes that and acts like that is normal and good. So yeah, please be wary of twin flame discussions because it would be a cool idea if it wasn't so horribly toxic. So yeah, just be aware about twin flame discussions. I don't like them. So I do want to talk a bit about what happens as love continues. And that means I'm going to discuss a bit about marriage or equivalent concepts to marriage. Um, so as you unite with the other half, you let arrows evolve. What happens? You merge. There becomes union. And perhaps I'll do a whole podcast on marriage in greater depth. But since I live in the West, I mean, marriage is the most common way this is explained. And in the ancient world, marriage was very much a thing. So typically, what happens is if your arrows continues, your relationship deepens, you become closer and closer. You start to heal your other half, right? You heal each other through your love. And I don't mean codependency. I don't mean trauma bonding. I don't mean, becoming like each other's emotional support dogs. I mean genuine healing through the power of love. Those are different things. Be wary of that. If you are a naturally codependent person, just keep that in mind. If you have like a really extreme anxious attachment style, keep that in mind. But real love is inherently healing because real love is divine. Once again, I said it's divine madness. It is a godly experience to have that true love type experience. And so it does heal you because anything that gets you closer to the gods is inherently healing because we're wounded by being detached from the gods. So as things evolve, you unite, we become one. The whole concept of marriage is two individuals becoming one unit, uniting, merging, becoming one being. It is an attempt to reconnect the detached two parts into one part. And I think the Christian way of putting this is actually quite good. I'm not a Christian. I have a lot of critiques of Christianity, but I do think they get some things right. And I have no desire to just shit on a religion. While I'm not a Christian, certain ideas from them are not bad. And the way that they explain marriage, and I like this, is becoming one flesh. That's a really good way to put it because once again, we're merging, right? We're those two separate beings that are becoming one again. The skin is growing together. Some good body horror could be created about this because in my head, I'm like picturing like two separate people that have like a cut through them and then their skin growing over the cut. Maybe that's a little gory. Maybe don't picture that in your head. But yes, that idea. And when we look to the Celtic Isles of Europe, there is a specific marriage ritual that is very common in pagan traditions that I really, really like called hand fasting. So, hand fasting, it was actually brought back, excuse me, when religions like Wicca started coming into the picture. I think Wicca has repopularized this, and I think that's great. I have a lot of different opinions on Wicca. I don't hate Wicca. I don't love everything about Wicca. I think the truth is, when we talk about paganism, Wicca is a big part of our history. If you're a pagan in 2025, your communities, your concepts, all of that is heavily influenced by Wicca. Whether you like Wicca or not, that's the reality. And so what Wicca brought back have become repopularized. And I think things like hand fasting coming back into the picture is a really great thing. I think hand fasting is really cool, and I think hand fasting has a very obvious metaphysical backing to it. So, what happens when you hand fast? Essentially, you tie your hand together to the person you are marrying, and you keep that rope that tied your hands together. You don't ever untie it. And what is a tie? So, a common type of magic in magical traditions is binding, or latching two things together permanently. A very common type of love spell that is used to either attract people or strengthen a pre-existing relationship is to take two candles and tie them together and burn them down together. This has multiple uses. A lot of people associate it with targeted love spells, but it's also used very frequently to make people's relationships simply better. And what is that? That's a binding. That's latching two things together. Binding is a scary word, and I think modern witch culture has made people think binding is like some bad thing or some like curse-like thing. No, binding is good. We bind ourselves to things all the time. Anything we make a commitment to, we have bound ourselves to. And what is marriage but a commitment? And so binding yourself to the other person makes sense. Ignore all those witch talk posts that are like, never bind yourself to another person. Bullshit. We bind ourselves to things all the time. Perhaps this is that I have some pretty heavy Saturn placements in my chart, but we're always binding ourselves. We're always committing. And I will talk about Saturn a bit in relation to love in a second. But yes, it is binding yourself to another person. And that's a very potent pagan marital ritual. And if you are to divorce after a hand fasting, you actually have to cut that cord. And the idea of cord cutting is very common in modern magic too, where you like take two strings and you cut them in half to represent the severing of a relationship. You can do a cord cutting to even sever your relationship to concepts or things or a toxic job or whatever, right? And so that merging, it naturally comes from Eros. That desire naturally comes from Eros, and it does inevitably happen. Now, there are many different pagan marital rituals from around the world. Perhaps I'll have to do a whole podcast on that one. But they all sort of represent this binding. And I want to talk a bit about the astrology and planetary meaning behind love. So there are three planets that come into play when we're talking about love astrologically. That would be Mars, Venus, and Saturn, and maybe the moon. And this does relate to pagan metaphysics because astrology is an ancient idea. A lot of people associate astrology with like silly girls on the internet. That is a misrepresentation of a divine concept. Astrology is much more complicated than the cosmo horoscopes that talk about how to have a good weekend, right? Astrology is a sacred science. Astrology was accepted as a form of proper science until pretty close to modernity. Astronomy and astrology have a merged history. They only fractured relatively recently. And nobility of the ancient world all accepted astrology. Astrology has been used in literal battle planning, and modern financial people use astrology a lot, and relatively modern political figures have used astrology as well. Astrology is very complicated and dense. The astrology that people look down upon are like those horoscopes in magazines, and like, yeah, you can look down on those. I look down on them too. No shame in doing that, but understand that like a silly watered down version of something existing does not mean the original thing isn't good. Right. So those three planets, and this is ancient wisdom. are Venus. So Venus is love, beauty, romance, and all those romantic parts of your relationship relate to Venus, your romantic desires. And so looking at your natal chart and seeing what sign your Venus is in, that's actually what you want out of a romantic relationship, and what house it's in. That's often how you will find that person. So it can be really valuable to look at your chart. Now, the other one is Mars. Mars is sex, passion, aggression, war, all that sexual stuff that relates to love. Because, and I was actually going to talk about sex in this podcast, but not going to have time for that because this is a really complicated podcast. So that'll be another episode. I'll talk about like sex and how to deal with sex and culture around sex and all that. But that's all related to Mars. How you are in that part of your life comes from your Mars sign and your house. It's very interesting to look when you are thinking about what you want in a partner is to ignore all this strategizing nonsense and actually look at what your Mars and your Venus are, because that's going to show you your actual personal desires. And often they can seem seemingly contradictory, right? Like for me, I have my Venus in Taurus and my Mars in Sagittarius. Taurus is a very stability seeking sign. Taurus wants comfort. And then, my Mars Sagittarius. Sagittarius is a adventure seeking, excitement seeking type of sign. It's one that is very much about growth and whatnot. And those seem contradictory, but you can actually find both those traits in one person. For me, like if I were to search for my soulmate, I would want someone who can give me stability, but also give me excitement and adventure at the same time. There are people who have both of those qualities. So even if your Venus and Mars kind of seem in contradiction with each other, look at what that actually could mean, because people have more than one trait. I think a lot of people hear this and they're like, well, I'm going to look for someone with the sun sign of my Venus sign. It's a lot more complicated than that. We have more than one sign in our chart. We have many signs in our chart. And so just looking for people who balance those desires are going to be what you really want. Looking at the houses these are in can also help you know like where that person will be and where you can meet them. Because there's a lot of places to meet people besides a dating app, right? If you see your Venus, I'm making this up, this isn't my chart, but let's say your Venus is in the house of health, maybe you'll meet a doctor. I don't know. Or if it's in the house of career, maybe you'll meet your loved one at the office, right? There's a lot of things you can see within where things are placed. Now, the other sign that relates to love is Saturn. So Saturn, people are like, what are you on about? Let me explain. So Saturn rules death, discipline, boundaries, restrictions. So what on earth does that have to do with love? That has to do with commitment. So marriage, commitment, that's actually all Saturnian. I mean, look in the sky. Saturn has rings. What do you do when you commit to someone? You put on a ring, right? You can see it right there. The concept of binding yourself or committing to a person or uniting with a person, that's Saturnian, because Saturn is restriction. Saturn are rules. Saturn is regulation. And so when we think about sort of that contractual side to marriage, because marriage is as much a love thing as it is a contract, that's all related to Saturn. So those three planets in your chart are going to play into what you desire, what you need, and looking at those can help you understand yourself, because a big part of spiritual evolution is understanding ourselves. A lot of people don't understand themselves, right? They're like, oh, well, I can describe myself in this way. They can take the Myers-Briggs type indicator and get a number, right? But they don't know who they really are, and they don't know who they really want. And I think a lot of people turn to bad dating advice because they don't know what they want, right? They look up like, what is a high value man? And they read articles on what a high value man is and are like, okay, well, I'm going to search for an HVM, right? And they don't consider what they personally need, what they want, and what they're lacking. Looking at what you lack in your chart, what you're deficit in, what your detriments are, can really help you understand what you lack so you can find a partner who meets those things so that you can become a stronger whole. Right? What you really want and what you're supposed to want are often not the same thing. As people, we understand that true will is a goal. I've talked a lot about true will. Your true will is not the shoulds in life. Those are very different things. Your true will is a deep need that you personally have that you have to discover through relationship with the gods, right? That's often not what you're told to want. And so really considering who you are, knowing yourself is a big part of this. A big part of finding love is contemplation and understanding yourself and going into your shadow and integrating your shadow and doing a lot of deep internal work. We often are uncomfortable with the idea that we have to do internal work, even when people go to therapy. Sometimes people go to therapy not to improve themselves, but just to get validated, right? If we want to be good partners, we have to do the work on ourselves and understand that perhaps we have problems too, which we do. We have great things about us and problems within us. So working through our own problems is a big part of love. And when you do that, you also understand who you really are, so you can get what you really want. So you can have an Eros-based relationship and not a Philia-based relationship. Once you get there, you can then experience Eros, and Eros can actually help you know yourself more. Relationships are supposed to be healing, not hell stress experiences. Too many people have ball and chain relationships and not Eros love driven relationships. And while you're in a relationship, you should always be strengthening your relationship. Pray to Venus, do Venus remediation, do work with Mars, do rituals to make your relationship better. It doesn't end once you unite. There's still a lot that happens after that in your life. Right? And so turning to the gods to make your relationship better is really valuable. And doing rituals. Yes, I'm saying bindings can be good. Bindings can help your relationship get stronger. All of those things can be really valuable in making your relationship work long term. So, this has been Pagan Perspectives. We are supported on Patreon. You get a bonus episode every episode, or bonus pre-show, excuse me. They're not full-length episodes, they're like mini episodes. You get a bonus episode 8 times a year. And I am Dot Darling or Georgina Rose. I'm under Dot Darling on all social media under the sun, mainly on YouTube. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, please leave a review. Unless it's a bad review, don't do that. And I will see you guys all in the next ones. I hope you all consider what your pagan perspective is. Bye!